be used to that. So it's a girl.
Hello and welcome to I Can't Believe It's Not the Mouse, the podcast all about animated movies not made by Disney. I'm your host, Octaviano Macias, and today I'm talking about a Halloween animated feature. One of the very few that actually takes place on Halloween. I am, of course, talking about the 2006 Oscar-nominated Monster House. Now, a lot of people have probably already forgotten about this movie. I wouldn't say it wasn't a hit when it came out. It was a pretty decent hit when it came out. It just hasn't really been talked about since, at least I've noticed, and kind of disappointing really, because it's actually a really solid movie. Now, if you're completely unaware of Monster House is, like I said, an animated feature that is basically, while it takes place on Halloween, also deals with the weird neighbor's house. Now, we've seen this before in a lot of kids' movies. We've seen it before in a lot of suspenseful movies, where you have the kid who's like, hey, look, there's this weird neighbor across the street who always is like mean, kids don't like going to his house, all that stuff. This movie kind of plays around with that idea by taking it to the logical extreme. What if the house was haunted? And more specifically, what if the house was alive? It's a pretty silly concept, but it ends up being played very clever. You got the main character, DJ, who is pretty much like the weird kid. He's going through puberty, and most of this movie is pretty much taking place in his house and across the street from the monster house. So there's not a whole lot of locations you see in this movie. You do eventually see them going into different places, but it's not that often. And while that may be just a thing because they had to save budget on stuff, I mean, this is not a very expensive looking movie. Even back when it came out, it didn't really look all that expensive. The tech might be, though, considering that I know this is from Image Movers, who normally does this is from Image Movers, who, if you aren't aware of, is Robert Zemeckis' company. He's the guy who made like The Polar Express, Beowulf. Prior to that, he made stuff like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Castaway. A lot of really good movies. A lot of movies that use tech called motion capture, which is basically you have actors acting out a scene. They're in full like green screen suits or stuff like that, and whatever they're doing gets caught into the movement. So the tech was technically stuff that would be expensive, but the actual animation doesn't really look like it. This is actually one of the few motion capture movies where the characters are done more stylistically. They're more cartoony looking, and to be fair, that's really to the movie's strength. Because I got nothing against motion capture. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The problem is that motion capture normally doesn't look good over the years. Even sometimes it doesn't even look good in the same time it came out in. Just because they're really trying to do the realistic look. It's, the uncanny valley, and it just does not work. So yeah, oftentimes the animation on this stuff does not look good. I mean, The Polar Express, creepy. Beowulf looks creepy too, honestly. Even something as, like from the later years, like The Christmas Carol or Mars Needs Mom, those look creepy. I mean, the only one that I've ever seen that didn't look creepy, which wasn't really done by this company, was the Tintin movie. That one looks fine, but that one also goes into somewhat of a stylistic choices with some of the characters in terms of the design. So that's why it mostly works. This movie, Monster House, specifically, it's all very stylistically, they're very cartoony, so it never looks weird. The only thing that looks off is that a lot of the times the characters' movements are very stiff, like they look very mechanical, but you can get by that, honestly. The animation is honestly not that great, even going beyond that. Like, you can tell the characters look very plasticky at times, like the hair just looks kind of like Play-Doh. Honestly, the most detailed thing, which is probably the most important thing anyways, is the house itself. The monster house looks really great. Like, a lot of the times when you see just like the little ways they make this thing come alive, whether it's giving it teeth, making it fix up itself, giving it arms, just all those little things always looks great. Like, even, over a decade later, because this is, of course, 15 years since this came out, and yeah, that stuff looks great. The characters, not so much, but at the very least, they're not ugly to look at. Like, it's not like a lot of the other motion capture movies where I'm like, please put these characters away. They look creepy. For the most part, it's fine, and since so few characters that you have to deal with, you're mostly fine with it throughout the movie, because it's really just the main character, DJ, his best friend, Chowder. There's eventually a little girl that comes along with their team. there's a babysitter, but she barely factors into the movie. There's a couple of cops, again, barely factor into the movie. Pretty much the most important character outside of those three kids is just the elderly neighbor who is in this house, and at first you think like, oh, he's just a mean neighbor due to some accident early on where he's supposed to be dead, but he comes back later on in the movie, so it turns out that he was just hospitalized. He's like the only other character that is basically a major player in the story. And funny enough, he's probably the character that I would say design-wise and everything looks the best out of the people, which is funny because he's the one that is supposed to look like the most ugly, the most creepy, because he's supposed to be like the nasty old man. But it's a really good design because once you realize like, oh, he wasn't actually being mean, he was trying to protect the kids from this house because he knows that the house is deadly. He does kind of soften up a bit, and the transformation from nasty old man to kind old man is very apparent, so it is a really good design when you look at it from that perspective. But yeah, it's just a really good design, honestly. The house, him, really good designs. The other characters, not so much, but again, they're not horrifying to look at like a lot of motion capture stuff, so for the most part I am actually fine with everything else, even though it hasn't aged the best, so I will say that much. But going into the movie itself, it's just a really solid Halloween horror kids feature, just because a lot of this is very much like an older movie. This was produced by like Steven Spielberg, and yeah, you can notice it right away because a lot of it has the sensibilities of an 80s movie. Like even the main characters, like at some point when they introduce like the little girl that goes along with them, they're all like around the same age, like 10 like 12, 13ish characters. And one of the things I love about this movie is that they don't shy away from the fact that these kids are hormonal. Like the two main characters, DJ and Chowder, are fucking horny for this girl. Like they the second she pops up, they are literally trying to simp for her. They're pretty much like trying to please her. They're trying to find any way to impress her, while of course trying to solve this issue of the monster house. So it's always funny stuff. It never comes off creepy. It always feels like actual things that a lot of movies just don't touch upon because they're always like, oh yeah, this is the age where boys start getting into girls, but you never see that in full effect. This is one of the rare movies, animated or live action, where you actually see like, yeah, these guys are definitely horn dogs, but it's not done in a creepy way. It's fairly tame. It's just appreciative that it's there. But even beyond that, a lot of the horror elements just feels like something that you would have seen in an 80s horror kids film. Not just because it's a house, so it's technically less scary, because a lot of this stuff does get really intense. I mean, this movie was rated PG when it came out, and I remember they had to cut it down. It was originally going to be like PG-13, but they had to cut out on some stuff. Like mainly what ended up getting them the PG rating was just, and this is kind of spoilers, but who cares really? A lot of the characters that the monster house eats later come back in the movie, so it's like, oh, well, it's a house, so technically even though I ate them, they didn't really die. And yeah, it's kind of like, then how come they didn't pop out earlier when the characters, whatever, it doesn't matter. That's what they did to get it down to a PG rating, and you know what? If that was a trade-off, I'm fine with it, because a lot of the stuff in this is really neat, intense horror sequences, like on the ways the house tries to get people to, eat them, like whether it's using the trees right there to grab people, or like raising the pavement. It's all stuff that is like, this is solid horror movie stuff, and it's really fun seeing it in motion with this movie because it's just creative, it's clever, it's stuff that you don't see in a lot of movies, whether it's animated or even live action. Like even some R-rated horror movies are not as clever as this is when it comes to like the scare scenes. And of course, kids are still going to be able to watch it. It is still a fun little movie for kids to watch. It's just that the way they do it is just kind of intense, and it's just great, honestly. It's not something that you get often, whether it was back then or even now. Like, the fact that going back to like the whole Spielberg thing, that Spielberg was one of the producers on this makes a whole lot of sense, considering that a lot of this feels like something that would have come out during Spielberg's, major era in the 80s. It just feels like a really love letter to horror movies, especially of this kind, and just the idea of it being like the creepy neighbor, and then it turns out that, hey, the creepy neighbor has an actual, monster in his house. because that is the house, which is neat, honestly. And then looking at it, one of the things that kind of surprised me was that this was one of the writers on this. I don't want to give him full credit, but it's the name that popped out the most. One of the writers on this was Dan Harmon. Now, if you don't know who Dan Harmon is the creator of Community. He's the co-creator of Rick and Morty. And the second I saw that, I'm like, that makes a whole lot of sense, because this feels like something that Dan Harmon would write. Then upon further reading it, I read that Dan Harmon actually trashed this movie once it came out, because apparently the director of this movie, Gil Keenan, and Steven Spielberg made some changes to the script that Dan Harmon apparently didn't like. Which, hearing that, I'm like, that makes even more sense than, now knowing that, because this definitely feels like a Dan Harmon thing, in terms of just the idea of the monster being a house feels like something that Dan Harmon would do to kind of satirize this kind of movie. It does kind of lean in too much into like just being a genuine thing, like, and not that it's bad. I actually do like that they go all in on the idea of the monster, the house being a monster. But I feel like, granted, I don't know, maybe it was different, but I feel like maybe in his version, we would have never found out whether or not the house was actually a monster, or why it was even a monster to begin with. Because I know the one thing that they did mention was that apparently it was the director's idea to change like the backstory on the house, because eventually you realize that the house is pretty much, like, there's a reason why it's alive. And this is spoiler, so if you haven't seen the movie, I'm about to spoil it, just because it's kind of important to explain this. It turns out that within the movie, it turns out that the reason why the house is alive is because the older neighbor's wife actually died during the making of the house, and her spirit was pretty much trapped in the house. And it sounds weird, but when you watch it in the movie, it just feels right, because it is that kind of movie where that kind of stuff would make sense. That being said, it is kind of a out there curveball, out of left field thing that they don't really build up too much on. Like, they do kind of mention early on about the wife, but even then it kind of feels tacked on to a point that hearing that this was an idea that was not originally in the script and was added on later on makes a lot of sense. Again, I actually do like the idea of the twist. It feels natural to it, but I can see it being tacked on, because it does feel like once that's revealed, it's like, okay, this just kind of came out of nowhere. Again, I'm not sure if this is what he specifically hated, but it wouldn't surprise me, because it is the one thing that I'm like, okay, so this was added on later. And normally, like, if you've seen any Dan Harmon stuff, like Community, Rick and Morty, probably Rick and Morty especially, is that they kind of play around with like typical stuff, like cliches that you see in these kinds of stories. So I kind of feel like maybe it was just that it ended up becoming exactly one of those stories, instead of something that was kind of mocking the idea of those stories that he hated, but I'm not entirely sure. That would just be my guess. Either way, the fact that he didn't like what ended up happening makes sense, because I've normally seen a few of his things where he doesn't like certain things. Like, I know with Rick and Morty, he really hated the episode where they made fun of like the Avengers with like the Vindicator. So yeah, the idea that he didn't like the end product makes sense, but the idea that he was at one point connected to it, again, makes sense. Either way, regardless of how he feels, I still really love the movie. I mean, it is a really solid concept. It's the kind of thing that at first glance you would say sounds really goofy, really cheesy, but the movie not only delivers, but it actually makes it feel genuine and sincere in a way that it feels like, okay, this isn't mocking those kinds of movies, but it is one of those movies. It's just going with the silliest possible route, but it still feels natural to it. And yeah, it's just a ton of fun, because you get a lot of really good jokes aside from the scares. That was like one of the things that kind of scared me rewatching this, because I haven't really seen it in years. Like, I've only seen like snippets here and there, and I'd be like, I don't know if the character of Chowder really holds up, because I know he's constantly saying stupid shit, but there's some really funny stuff. Like, of course, at one point they're inside the house trying to find a way to kill her from inside, and when they look at the layout, they realize, okay, wait, the little chandelier that's up there is kind of like the uvula of this house. At which point Chowder mentions like, oh, so it's a girl house, and it's just a stupid line, but you kind of love it. And I love that even with that, even though it's just a setup for a stupid joke, it ends up actually paying off in a big way later in the movie, pretty much to get them out of the house. And that's another thing I could appreciate about this movie. A lot of the stuff kind of feels built up, or like they do the planting and payoff really well, which is not something that you can say with a lot of movies, especially nowadays, because I've noticed a lot of times they don't really set up a lot of these things properly anymore. And not to say that, movies don't do it anymore, but it's just that there's a lot of movies that don't do it as often as they did with this, or as cleverly. So every time I see that, especially with blockbusters, Hollywood movies, it's always just neat. But yeah, it's just a really clever movie, and honestly, it's just hilarious. It's the kind of thing that I would definitely watch more often on Halloween. Like if I did like Halloween watches, I don't really like doing the whole thing where I'm like, oh, it's my annual ceremony of movies or whatever. I mean, not that I don't watch certain movies, at certain times of the year, but I don't like actually doing, planning out like, okay, this time of the year I'm gonna watch these movies exactly. Like I'm like, if I watch that movie, great. If I don't, maybe next year, maybe not. Who knows? I don't really care. Like I said, I haven't really watched this movie in years. Seeing it that it does hold up is always a treat, and I'm glad that so far a lot of the movies I've done for this show that I have seen for like years, that I haven't seen in years, do hold up. So that's always neat. In regards to Monster House, like I said before, it's just really charming that it holds up. A lot of the jokes are still clever. A lot of the scares are really clever. I mean, there's at one point in the movie early on where the main character is asleep and you see like the shadow of the house coming in and there's like a hand popping out, and it's just this really weird scene that doesn't really do much. Like you don't know whether this is supposed to be a nightmare, whether it's supposed to be like the house spirit actually trying to haunt him. You don't really know, but you kind of don't care because it's just a really neat scene to witness in this movie, and it's just that stuff I always appreciate whenever they can just go in and do like, you know what, we're gonna do a weird scene. Whether or not it fully works in the movie, I don't know, but look, you're gonna remember the scene, you're gonna appreciate the scene. Why are you gonna even complain about the scene? I really love that kind of stuff. And of course, it's just it's just a really solid Halloween movie, which is kind of weird when you think about it. You ever notice how there's a lot of Halloween movies, movies that get listed as Halloween movies, but they're only Halloween movies in the sense that there's a monster in it and it's kind of spooky. Like that's kind of the thing. Like you look at like, Hotel Transylvania, which I'm not knocking Hotel Transylvania like any of them, because there are good movies, but they're all labeled as like Halloween movies. But it's like none of these movies take place on or around Halloween. They're just movies that have monsters like Dracula, Frankenstein, and whoever else in it. Last week's movie, Wallace and Gromit, the Curse of the Rare Rabbit, it's labeled as a Halloween movie, but again, not really taking place around the Halloween season, as far as I know. I mean, the most that you get out of that is that you got people who are doing like vegetables and whatnot, but even then, that could be at any point in the year. It's just that I know a lot of people often associate it, especially with some of the vegetables being pumpkins, being within the fall season, but again, not really something where it's specifically Halloween. This one is one of the few where it's like, yeah, it's on Halloween because they mention it specifically multiple times, and the ending is like, hey, look, the mean old man is giving back people their stuff that the house ate over the years as Halloween, like not really the candy, but like pretty much like giving them like their Halloween presents. Yeah, this is one of the few movies where it's just Halloween-centric, which has always made me wonder, why is it that when it comes to Halloween stuff, we're more open to the idea of like, hey, look, as long as it's in the mood of Halloween, we'll count it as a Halloween movie. But when it comes to something like Christmas, where people get more picky about it, even when there's movies where they take place on Halloween, like say Batman Returns or Die Hard or whatever, and people go like, oh, well, you can't count those because they're like action movies or they're not really focused on Christmas. But I'm like, they're centered around the holiday though, and like they take place around the holiday. A lot of the plot points are based specifically on said holiday, and there are like little, maybe the music, maybe the feel of it is still Christmas based. So why do people get picky on that? I never understood that. I know I'm going off on a tangent, but it's just something that I really want to say regarding that. And what better time than with a movie that taking place in Halloween, so it is, yes, technically a Halloween movie, and it's one of the few that actually does that. So why is it that we can acknowledge all this stuff being Halloween and not the Christmas stuff? I don't know. It's crazy. It's dumb if you ask me, but that's kind of how it is. But with that out of the way, let's just get this done with some final thoughts. Monster House, really good movie. It's creepy. It's funny. It feels like the kind of movie that you would have seen in the 80s, for better, and of course at times for worse, in terms of just some of the stuff that might not hold up, but there's not a whole lot, realistically. The animation, it delivers in parts, mainly in the house and the way the old man is animated, but when it comes to anything else, it's not awful, it's just not that great, and yeah, in that regard, kind of disappointing, but hey, it happens. Can't really complain on that. Story-wise, very clever, it's very well written. I know Dan Harmon would probably disagree, but it happens. I know if I wrote something and it was changed, even if it was for the better, I might not be too happy, especially if they went behind my back. So I can't really complain too much. And hey, we all got different tastes. Yeah, it's just a really good time. Compared to the other motion capture movies that I've seen, not the best one. That still goes to Tintin. For the image mover stuff, the Robert Zemeckis movies, this is probably the best one. Polar Express is just kind of fine. Beowulf, fine. Christmas Carol, fine. Marceline's Moms Can Go to Hell. But yeah, this is really clever, and it's a shame that more movies didn't bother advancing the tech using what this movie did right, which is making it stylistically, like, you can do the stuff that they did with this and still make it work if you didn't focus too much on trying to make it realistic, because that always looks creepy. But yeah, it's just a really solid movie, really scary. Honestly, if you haven't seen it yet, definitely watch it, especially now for Halloween. It's on Netflix. The idea that a house can be so threatening is kind of silly, but it works. It really does. So yeah, go watch Monster House. It's a really solid movie. Yeah, it's a genuinely satisfying horror movie for Halloween. So what else do you want me to say? So to wrap things up, thank you for watching. This has been Octaviano Macias, host of I Can't Believe It's Not the Mouse. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. That's Psycam Films. And if you want to support me even more than that, I do have a Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/Psycams. SAICAMS. www.patreon.com/Psycams. Thank you for listening. I hope to see you again next time.
Well, Dad, why didn't you kiss my hairy butt? Did you drink any beer?
Hey, just wanted to say thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. Comment below if you had any thoughts on this. And if you want to support me even more, there's always the option of Patreon. Yes, I have a Patreon. Patreon would be a great way to help me grow this channel, as it's a great way to get equipment, a great way to let me know what you guys like, and it's a great way to help me financially. Just saying, the more I have on Patreon, the more time I'll have for these videos. Anyway, thanks again for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.